Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into something fascinating. It's a topic that's been quietly but powerfully reshaping global finance and climate action. We're talking carbon pricing and carbon markets. Yeah, and we've dug through some really interesting stuff for you. We've got the World Bank's latest State and Trends of Carbon Pricing 2025 report, plus some sharp analysis from carboncredits.com, and great insights from Russ Seri on global carbon market trends for 2025. So our mission, really, for you, the listener, is to unpack how this whole carbon pricing thing went from being kind of a niche idea to a major global financial force. What does it actually mean for cutting emissions? And maybe most importantly, how does it filter down to economies and, well, your everyday life? Okay, let's get into it.
Yeah.
So let's start right at the beginning. When we talk about carbon pricing, what are we actually, describing?
Basically, yeah, at its heart, it's about making pollution costly, putting a price tag on carbon emissions. The whole idea is to make the polluters pay for the environmental damage, right? Which should push them to cut back.
Okay, makes sense. And what are the main ways governments are doing this?
Well, broadly, there are two main tools we see globally. You've got straightforward carbon taxes, and then you have these things called emissions trading systems, or ETSs. People often just call them ETS.
Right, ETSs.
Got it.
And the growth, it's been pretty incredible. If you look back just 20 years, maybe only 10 of these carbon pricing instruments existed worldwide. But fast forward to early 2025, that number shot up to 80 instruments.
80 from 10.
Yeah, 80. It breaks down to 43 carbon taxes and 37 of those ETSs. It's a huge shift in global economic thinking.
That's a massive acceleration. But is it just about having more systems, or are they actually covering more ground, so to speak? What's the real impact?
Oh, it's definitely both.
Yeah.
The sheer number shows how widely it's being adopted, sure. But the key thing is that their reach is growing, too. These systems now cover roughly 28% of global greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, 28%. That's up from 24% just the year before, right? Exactly. A notable jump. Now, 28% is significant progress, especially that quickly. But, it also kind of highlights how much is still not covered. Getting to a level where it really bites means expanding into tricky areas like agriculture, transport.
Right, those are tougher nuts to crack than just industry.
Totally different challenges, politically and economically. But it's fundamentally about repricing pollution on a huge scale.
So what's behind this big global push? Why are so many governments getting on board now?
Well, Axel van Trotzenberg at the World Bank puts it really clearly. He talks about carbon pricing being this powerful sort of multi-tool. It obviously helps countries cut their emissions. That's the main goal. But it also generates significant revenue for governments. It stimulates green growth, creates jobs. And importantly, these markets are becoming crucial for pulling in private money, private capital for development priorities. Governments see the wins, both economic and environmental.
Okay, so multiple benefits. And you mentioned ETSs earlier.
Mm.
Are they becoming more popular than taxes?
We are seeing a definite trend towards ETSs, yeah. They tend to get favored because they offer, more flexibility. They're market-driven. Basically, companies can buy and sell emission allowances. This creates a price signal for carbon, sure, but it also lets industries figure out the cheapest way to cut their own emissions over time.
So it really feels like this is becoming a global standard. What does it actually mean for you, listening, that countries making up, 2/3 of global GDP are using these tools now?
It means a huge chunk of the world economy is now starting to bake in the cost of carbon. It's not just a European thing or a North American thing anymore. We're seeing emerging economies really step up. Chile has expanded its scheme. South Africa is strengthening its carbon tax. And you've got big players like Brazil, Turkey, India actively designing new systems right now.
Wow.
It really signals this worldwide acceptance that carbon has a cost and our economies need to adjust.
And are these systems starting to link up at all?
That's another fascinating trend, yeah. They're starting to intertwine across borders. Look at the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the CBAM. It's basically a carbon tariff on imports.
Right, I've heard about that.
It levels the playing field for EU companies, but crucially, it also pressures other countries to price carbon themselves if they want to export to the EU without that extra cost. And even within the US, you see states talking about linking their carbon markets.
So interconnectedness is growing.
Absolutely. It points towards a future of more linked-up carbon pricing, which could seriously boost efficiency and climate action globally.
Okay, let's talk money. Because this next figure, when I saw it in the reports, it really jumped out. The sheer scale of the revenue. Walk us through that. How much did these systems pull in during 2024?
It is pretty staggering. Last year, governments around the world collected about $103 billion through carbon pricing.
$103 billion.
Yep. And just for context, that's more than 3 times what they collected back in 2013. It's a really significant and growing revenue stream.
It's incredible growth.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned two main types, taxes and ETSs. Where did most of that $103 billion come from?
The lion's share came from the emissions trading systems, the ETSs. They generated about 67% of the total revenue.
Okay, two-thirds from ETSs.
Right. And carbon taxes accounted for the other third, about 33%.
Any reason why ETSs dominate the revenue side so much?
Well, it's partly because ETSs often cover those really large industrial emitters, which are obviously big sources of carbon. And they also tend to operate in economies where carbon prices, the allowance prices, are generally higher. Plus, many of the world's biggest economies using these tools, like the EU and China, they rely heavily on ETSs. So that naturally boosts the ETS share of the global total.
Which specific systems were the biggest contributors then?
By far the biggest was the EU's ETS. That system alone brought in 41% of all global carbon revenues. Just the EU.
Wow, nearly half from the EU ETS.
Yeah. Then you had Germany's national ETS, that was second with 14%, and Canada's federal carbon tax was third, generating about 9%. What's really striking, though, is that just 10 systems, 10 jurisdictions, were responsible for 86% of all that global carbon revenue.
So it's quite concentrated in a few major players.
Very much so.
Now, $103 billion is huge, but was 2024 actually a record year, or did revenues fluctuate?
Interestingly, 2024 revenues were actually slightly down compared to 2023.
Oh, really? Why's that?
It was mainly due to some price shifts, some volatility in certain major markets during the year, and this is important, the long-term trend is still incredibly strong. Average carbon prices in key systems like the EU, the UK, New Zealand, they kept rising or at least stabilized at high levels.
So a minor dip, but the overall direction is still clearly upwards.
Exactly. The trajectory is definitely up.
It really gets you thinking about the potential here, doesn't it? What if these prices were higher, closer to what scientists say is needed? One of the sources we looked at had this kind of what-if scenario. What if all of 2024's global emissions were priced at, say, $50 per ton?
Right. If that were the case, the potential annual revenue could hit something like $2.6 trillion.
Trillion. With a T.
Trillion, yeah. $2.6 trillion.
It's enormous. Put that in perspective for us.
We'll connect that to the bigger picture. $2.6 trillion is roughly 2% of global GDP. And critically, it would absolutely dwarf current global climate finance flows. We talk about climate finance in the hundreds of billions, right? This is potentially trillions.
A completely different scale.
It just highlights the massive fiscal power these tools could have if they were implemented more broadly and at more effective price points. But that also brings us right back to that crucial price gap we talked about.
Right, the gap between current prices and what's needed.
Exactly. Many existing systems are still well below that $40 to $80 per ton range that economists often recommend for really driving change aligned with the Paris Agreement goals.
And that limits the impact.
Significantly. It limits both the environmental effectiveness, the push to cut emissions, and the potential fiscal benefits, the revenue generation.
Okay, so huge potential still untapped. But let's focus on the $103 billion that was collected. Where is that money actually going? This seems critical because how governments spend it must affect public support, right? And obviously the climate impact.
Absolutely. That's the key question. Because earmarking these funds, being transparent about where the money goes, that can really boost public buy-in. So in 2024, the biggest slice, about 56% of all the revenues collected, was specifically earmarked for environmental, climate, or development projects.
Okay, over half. What kind of projects are we talking about?
Things like direct investment in green infrastructure, funding for clean technology research and deployment, projects for climate adaptation, helping communities become more resilient, really tangible stuff.
That makes sense. So direct investment in the transition.
Yeah.
What about the rest of the money?
Well, about 25% went towards social and economic support measures. This broke down into direct transfers back to households, maybe rebates or credits. That was about 19% of the total revenue. And another 6% went to things like tax breaks for businesses, maybe to help them adjust.
So cushioning the impact a bit.
Exactly. And then the final 19% just flowed into general government budgets without a specific climate tag attached.
Okay. Still, good to see the majority is specifically climate-focused.
Yeah.
Are there any places doing particularly innovative things with this revenue? Any standout models?
Yeah, definitely. Germany is a good example. They channel their carbon revenues into a dedicated climate and transformation fund. This fund specifically backs clean energy,
Yeah.
energy efficiency, but it also includes social support to ensure the transition is, fair.
A dedicated fund. Interesting.
And maybe even more striking, the EU ETS. They recently mandated that 100% all of its revenue must now be spent on climate and energy purposes.
100%. Wow, that's up from what it was before.
Yeah, it used to be a 50% requirement before 2023. So that's a huge commitment to reinvesting directly into climate action.
That seems really significant.
Oh, it is. This kind of dedicated funding is vital for plugging that massive global climate finance gap we were talking about. And it means governments rely less on general taxes or just borrowing more money for these essential environmental projects. It's almost like a self-funding mechanism for building a greener future.
Right, using the price on pollution to directly pay for the solutions.
Precisely.
Oh. Okay, so we've covered the impressive revenue, how it's being spent, but carbon pricing isn't the same everywhere, right?
Right.
It's more like a patchwork quilt of different approaches across the globe. Let's maybe unpack some of those regional stories, different paths, but maybe shared goals.
Definitely. It's really varied on the ground. Let's start with the EU because it's often seen as the benchmark. It's the most mature market, covers almost half, 45% of the bloc's emissions. They've even recently brought the maritime sector under the ETS.
Shipping, right, that's a big one.
Huge. Now, their prices did wobble a bit, dropping to around 52 per ton back in February 2024, but they bounced back. And the long-term direction is clear. They're tightening the screws, reducing free allowances, bringing in this new ETS2 for buildings and transport. They're deepening their commitment.
Okay, so the EU is still leading the charge. What about China? Their national market is massive, isn't it?
It is, and it's expanding significantly. From 2025, they're adding big sectors like steel, cement, electrolytic aluminum. Once those are in, the system will cover something like 60% of China's national emissions. That's enormous coverage.
And what's happening with their prices?
They're surging. The average price for China emission allowances, or CEAs, jumped 44% year on year in 2024, hit record highs.
44% increase, wow.
Yeah, it's a really strong signal of growing demand and, frankly, serious intent from Beijing.
Okay, let's hop over to South Korea. They were early movers in East Asia, weren't they?
They were, yeah. East Asia's first national carbon market, the KETS, it covers a huge chunk of their emissions, almost 89%.
But how's it performing?
Well, that's the issue. Prices have been pretty sluggish, averaging only around 9,465 won per ton in 2024, which is quite low.
Why so low?
Mainly seems to be oversupply of allowances and relatively weak demand. And low prices, they blunt the incentive for companies to actually cut emissions.
But what are they doing about it?
They're actively working on reforms, trying to boost liquidity, bring in new financial tools like ETNs, exchange-traded notes tied to carbon and carbon futures trading. And they're also looking seriously at international cooperation under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement, linking up potentially.
Trying to energize the market. Makes sense. What about the United States? It's always a complex picture there.
Yeah, 2024 saw a lot of political uncertainty around climate policy. You've got the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, pouring huge amounts of money into clean energy, which is massive.
Right. The IRA funding is significant.
Absolutely. But there's still no national carbon price, no national ETS, which makes it harder for the U.S. to, say, align with the EU on things like carbon border adjustments, and it doesn't provide that consistent price signal across the whole economy.
And what's happening at the state level? I remember hearing about Washington State's ETS.
Right. Washington's system faced quite a backlash over rising fuel prices. It really highlights that constant tension, that balancing act between the cost impact on consumers today and the long-term climate goals. It's a tough sell sometimes.
Yeah, that political challenge seems universal. Okay, one more region, Southeast Asia. Sounds like things are heating up there.
Definitely emerging as a real carbon market hotspot. Lots of activity, though it's varied. Thailand has its voluntary offset program, TVER, and they're planning a carbon tax. Malaysia is running domestic credit auctions, getting ready for its own carbon tax by 2026. Vietnam's got an ETS pilot plan for 2025. Indonesia is expanding its ETS and just launched the IDX Carbon Exchange, the first stock exchange-run carbon market in the region.
So a lot of movement across Southeast Asia.
Yeah, everyone's positioning themselves. And again, you see the influence of global trends. The EU leads on regulation, its CBAM pushes others. It shows how these things are becoming interconnected. Global standards are slowly starting to take shape.
Okay, so governments are clearly busy setting up taxes and trading systems. But it's not just them, right? The private sector is also involved through what's called the voluntary carbon market.
That's right. It's a parallel track, but a really important one. You have private companies, especially big names in tech or energy-intensive industries, actively buying carbon credits.
Why are they doing that?
Lots of reasons. Often it's part of their own corporate climate goals, their net zero commitments, or just general CSR, corporate social responsibility. They're particularly interested in high quality credits, especially ones that actually remove carbon, like reforestation projects, or ones with strong co-benefits, like clean cooking projects in developing countries.
And how big is this voluntary market?
It's substantial. One figure that stood out was that by late 2024, there were nearly 1 billion tons of carbon credits sitting there, issued but not yet used or retired.
1 billion tons. That's a
Yeah.
huge overhang.
It is. It shows both the supply that's been generated and maybe also some hesitancy or pickiness from buyers waiting for clarity or focusing on specific types of credits. Companies use these credits, as I said, for voluntary goals, sometimes for compliance where rules allow, or just to offset specific things like emissions from business travel.
Okay. And is there anything on the horizon that might boost this market?
Yes, the big thing everyone's watching is Article 6 of the Paris Agreement.
Ah, Article 6. Heard a lot about that.
Yeah, the negotiations are complex, but the goal is to finalize the rules for international cooperation on emissions reductions, including how countries can trade credits between themselves and how private sector credits might fit in. Once those rules are clear, it's expected to really boost international trading of carbon credits. Could unlock huge cross-border investment flows and signal, really, a new era for global carbon trading.
Potentially linking up the compliance markets and the voluntary markets more closely.
Potentially, yeah. Or at least providing clearer standards and integrity, which the voluntary market desperately needs.
Okay, so looking across this whole dynamic landscape, what are the key takeaways? The big trends and maybe the important lessons learned so far. One thing that seems clear from the sources is how uneven the coverage is. You mentioned power and industry face most of the pricing, but huge sectors like agriculture, transport, they're largely untouched still.
That's a critical point. It shows where the progress has been, mainly the big stationary sources, but it also highlights the massive challenge ahead to get comprehensive coverage. And tackling sectors like agriculture or transport, they involve very different challenges. Think about millions of vehicles versus a few power plants. It often needs different policies, maybe subsidies alongside taxes, and you have to be really careful about the social impacts.
Right. And that brings us back to the political side, the public acceptance issue.
Exactly, which raises that crucial question. How important is public understanding and support for these things to actually work? We saw this play out vividly in Canada, for instance. They actually repealed their national carbon tax in 2025.
Even though the money was being returned to citizens.
Yeah, even with the revenue recycling, the rebates, the reasons often cited were things like poor communication about how it worked and just general anxiety about inflation and cost of living pressures.
So the policy design wasn't necessarily flawed, but the rollout and communication were.
It seems that way. It shows that you can have an economically sound policy on paper, but if the public doesn't understand it or feels it's unfair or it lands during tough economic times, getting that buy-in is incredibly difficult.
That really feels like the crucial lesson here for you, the listener, to take away. How vital that good policy design, yes, but also transparency and really clear communication are. They seem absolutely necessary to build public support and make sure these carbon pricing systems actually stick and work effectively.
Couldn't agree more. Without those elements, even the best-intentioned policies can really stumble. But, despite all these limitations, the price gap, the political hurdles, carbon pricing is still a fundamentally powerful tool. It's arguably indispensable for tackling climate change effectively, for raising those crucial funds for sustainable development we talked about, and for steering investment towards cleaner solutions.
Not a silver bullet, maybe.
Definitely not a silver bullet on its own, but it's a really foundational piece of the climate action puzzle. You probably can't solve the puzzle without it.
So, wrapping it all up then, carbon pricing. It's growing fast globally, it's generating serious money, it's funding key climate projects, and it's creating this really complex, dynamic market landscape that's, well, constantly changing. And maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Given how much potential we've talked about, that $2.6 trillion figure, for example, imagine what could happen with even better public understanding and maybe more innovative policy design. How much faster could that really accelerate the global energy transition? And what role can you play just by understanding these complex financial levers that are increasingly shaping our climate future? Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into carbon pricing and markets. We'll catch you on the next one.